In the misty forests of ancient Germania, along the winding banks of the Elbe River, a people emerged who would challenge the might of Rome itself and leave their mark across the breadth of Europe. These were the Suebi, a confederation of Germanic tribes whose story spans 7 centuries of warfare, migration, and cultural transformation. Tonight, as you settle into peaceful slumber, let us journey back through time to witness their remarkable rise and eventual dissolution into the very fabric of European civilization. The Suebi first emerged from the archaeological record during the Late Bronze Age, sometime around 1500 BCE, though their cultural identity crystallized during the early Iron Age between 900 and 700 BCE. Archaeologically, the Suebi are associated with the Jastorf culture and Przeworsk culture, and linguistically with early Elbe Germanic dialects. These early Germanic peoples developed along the fertile banks of the Elbe River, in what is now northern Germany, creating settlements that would endure for generations. Archaeological excavations throughout the Elbe Basin have revealed the distinctive material culture of these early Suebi settlements. Their pottery bore characteristic geometric patterns and rim treatments that remained consistent across multiple generations, creating a recognizable cultural signature. Their rectangular longhouses, constructed with wooden posts and wattle and daub walls, typically measured 15 to 25 meters in length, housing extended family groups around central hearths. These structures differed markedly from contemporary Celtic and other Germanic dwellings found elsewhere in Central Europe, suggesting an early development of distinct Suebi identity. Carbon dating of organic materials from these early contexts places the earliest definitively Suebi cultural markers around 900 BCE, though the cultural continuum suggests gradual development rather than sudden appearance. Bronze and early iron artifacts recovered from burial contexts include distinctive fibulae, weapons, and personal ornaments that show both local innovation and selective adoption of techniques from neighboring cultures. The reconstructed Proto-Germanic language spoken by early Suebi tribes showed specific phonological developments that distinguished it from other Germanic dialects of the period. Perhaps the most distinctive aspect of early Suebi culture was the characteristic hair not known to Romans as the Suebian knot. This hairstyle involved gathering the hair on the right side of the head and binding it into a tight knot, often secured with bone or metal pins. Archaeological evidence for this practice comes from preserved hair samples in bog burials and artistic representations on metalwork. The hair knot served multiple functions beyond mere ornamentation, identifying tribal affiliation, indicating warrior status, and demonstrating adherence to Suebi cultural norms. According to Roman sources, particularly Tacitus in his Germania, free Suebi men wore their distinctive hair knot throughout their lives, while slaves and prisoners were forbidden from adopting this style. The practice extended beyond simple hair arrangement to include specific grooming rituals and the use of various oils and dyes to maintain the knot's appearance. Young warriors often competed to achieve the most impressive and elaborate hair arrangements, with the most skilled receiving recognition and higher status within their war bands. Warrior traditions formed the cornerstone of early Suebi identity, developing sophisticated martial practices that would later prove formidable against Roman legions. Archaeological evidence from weapon burials reveals the evolution of Suebi military technology from Bronze Age spears and axes to sophisticated iron swords, shields, and specialized cavalry equipment. The typical Suebi warrior of the early Iron Age carried a long iron sword with a distinctive pommel design, a wooden shield reinforced with an iron boss and rim, and multiple spears of varying lengths for different combat situations. Training for warfare began in childhood, with boys as young as 7 years old participating in mock combat exercises using wooden weapons. Adult warriors organized themselves into age-graded societies that provided both military training and social structure. The most elite warriors, known as the comitatus, formed personal retinues around successful war leaders, creating bonds of loyalty that transcended tribal boundaries. These warrior bands engaged in regular cattle raiding, territorial disputes, and seasonal campaigns that maintained their fighting skills and provided opportunities for young men to prove their valor. The Suebi confederation structure emerged gradually from these warrior traditions and tribal customs, creating a complex political organization that allowed for both unity and local autonomy. Rather than a centralized kingdom, the Suebi developed a loose confederation of related tribes that shared cultural practices, religious beliefs, and military obligations while maintaining distinct territorial boundaries and leadership structures. This system proved remarkably adaptable, allowing rapid mobilization for large-scale conflicts while preserving local customs and governance. The major Suebi subtribes each developed specialized roles within the broader confederation. The Marcomanni, whose name translates to bordermen, established themselves as the primary military force along the Confederation's frontiers. Archaeological evidence from Marcomanni territories shows extensive fortifications, weapon caches, and evidence of professional warrior classes supported by agricultural surpluses. Their settlements featured defensive earthworks, palisades, and strategically positioned watchtowers that could coordinate responses to external threats. The Quadi occupied the eastern portions of Suebi territory, developing expertise in horse breeding and cavalry warfare that made them invaluable allies in military campaigns. Excavations in Quadi territories have revealed extensive horse burial sites, specialized equestrian equipment, and evidence of trade networks extending far into the Pontic steppes. Their warriors fought primarily as heavy cavalry using long lances, curved swords, and composite bows that combine Germanic craftsmanship with techniques learned from steppe nomads. The Hermunduri controlled crucial trade routes and river crossings, developing commercial expertise that provided economic foundation for the broader confederation. Their settlements show evidence of specialized craft production, including metalworking, pottery manufacture, and textile production that supplied both local needs and export trade. Hermunduri merchants established trading posts throughout central Germania, creating networks that facilitated both commercial exchange and political communication between distant Suebi communities. Territorial expansion patterns during the pre-Roman period reveal the systematic nature of Suebi growth and consolidation. Beginning from their Elbe River heartland, Suebi tribes gradually extended their influence southward and eastward through a combination of military conquest, political alliance, and demographic pressure. This expansion followed river valleys and natural corridors, with new settlements established at strategic locations that could control trade routes and provide defensive advantages. The process of expansion involved careful reconnaissance, negotiation with existing populations, and gradual integration of conquered territories into the Suebi Confederation structure. Rather than simple conquest and displacement, the Suebi often incorporated local elites into their political system, adopted useful technologies and practices from subject peoples, and established garrison settlements that maintained control while allowing cultural continuity. Archaeological evidence shows that Suebi expansion created a distinctive settlement pattern across central Germania. Major population centers developed at river confluences and natural crossroads, surrounded by networks of smaller agricultural settlements and defensive outposts. These centers featured large assembly halls, craft workshops, storage facilities, and religious sites that served both local populations and regional administrative functions. Religious practices and beliefs provided additional cohesion for the expanding Suebi Confederation. Archaeological evidence reveals shared ritual sites, common burial practices, and standardized religious artifacts that maintained cultural unity across dispersed populations. Sacred groves, hilltop sanctuaries, and seasonal gathering places served as focal points for confederation-wide religious observances that reinforced political and military alliances. By the middle of the 1st century BCE, the expanding Roman Republic had pushed its influence deep into Gaul, bringing it into inevitable contact with the formidable Suebi Confederation that dominated the territories beyond the Rhine. This collision between two of antiquity's most powerful military forces would reshape the political landscape of Central Europe and provide history with some of its most detailed accounts of Germanic society through the meticulous observations of Gaius Julius Caesar. Caesar's Commentarii de Bello Gallico, written between 58 and 50 BCE, represents our most comprehensive contemporary source for understanding the Suebi during this crucial period. His account, though filtered through Roman political objectives and cultural biases, provides unprecedented detail about Suebi military organization, social structure, and territorial extent. Caesar encountered the Suebi at the height of their power, when their confederation controlled vast territories stretching from the Elbe to the Danube and commanded the loyalty of over 100 distinct tribal groups. The Roman general's description of the Suebi reveals both admiration and concern for their military capabilities. He characterized them as by far the most warlike of all the Germans, and noted that they maintained a standing army of 100,000 warriors with an equal number held in reserve for territorial defense. This military organization impressed even experienced Roman commanders who recognized in the Suebi a level of coordination and discipline rarely seen among Germanic peoples. Caesar observed that the Suebi divided their population into two groups annually, one half dedicated to warfare and raiding, while the other remained home to manage agricultural production and territorial defense. This system ensured continuous military readiness while maintaining economic stability, enabling the Confederation to sustain prolonged conflicts without compromising their territorial security or subsistence base. The catalyst for direct Roman-Suebi confrontation emerged from the complex political situation in eastern Gaul, where the Sequani tribe had invited Germanic intervention in their ongoing conflict with the Aedui. Around 72 BCE, the Sequani leadership, desperate to break Aedui dominance in the region, had extended an invitation to Ariovistus, king of the Germanic Heruds tribe and a prominent leader within the Suebi Confederation. This decision would prove catastrophic for Gallic independence and provide Rome with a pretext for deeper involvement in Germanic affairs. Ariovistus arrived in Gaul with approximately 15,000 Germanic warriors, primarily drawn from Heruds, Marcomanni, Triboci, Vangiones, Nemets, Sedusii, and Suebi tribes. His initial success against the Aedui encouraged additional Germanic migration, and within a decade Ariovistus commanded over 120,000 Germanic settlers who had established permanent settlements in Sequani territory. The Germanic king demonstrated remarkable political acumen, negotiating recognition from the Roman Senate around 59 BCE, which granted him the prestigious title of friend and ally of the Roman people. However, Ariovistus's growing power and territorial ambitions soon alarmed both his Gallic hosts and Roman observers. The Germanic king demanded additional territory from the Sequani, claiming he needed land for 24,000 more Heruds warriors who were preparing to cross the Rhine. His forces had already occupied approximately one-third of Sequani territory, the most fertile agricultural lands in the region, and his demands for additional concessions threatened to reduce the Sequani to vassalage in their own homeland. The situation deteriorated rapidly when Ariovistus began asserting authority over other Gallic tribes, including the Aedui, who had traditionally maintained friendly relations with Rome. His warriors conducted raids throughout eastern Gaul, seizing cattle, grain stores, and captives while establishing fortified settlements that served as bases for further expansion. The Germanic king's forces employed tactics that combined traditional Germanic warfare with innovations learned from Gallic opponents, including improved siege techniques and coordinated cavalry operations. Roman concern intensified when Ariovistus began recruiting additional warriors from across the Rhine, drawing upon the vast manpower reserves of the Suebi Confederation. Intelligence reports reaching Roman commanders described massive Germanic gatherings along the Rhine's eastern banks, with tribal contingents arriving from territories as distant as the Elbe River basin. These reinforcements brought the total Germanic force in Gaul to potentially 200,000 warriors and settlers, creating a demographic shift that threatened to permanently alter the region's ethnic composition. Caesar's decision to intervene against Ariovistus in 58 BCE reflected both immediate strategic concerns and longer-term Roman objectives in Gaul. The Germanic king's growing power threatened Roman allies, disrupted established trade networks, and created a precedent for large-scale Germanic migration that could destabilize Roman frontier regions. Additionally, Ariovistus's success encouraged other Germanic leaders to consider similar ventures, potentially creating multiple Germanic kingdoms within striking distance of Roman territory. The Roman commander's initial diplomatic overtures to Ariovistus revealed the Germanic king's confidence and political sophistication. When Caesar requested a meeting to discuss territorial boundaries and the treatment of Roman allies, Ariovistus responded with a carefully crafted message that demonstrated his understanding of Roman political language while asserting Germanic rights to conquered territory. The king argued that his presence in Gaul resulted from legitimate invitation by the Sequani, that his victories had been won through superior courage and military skill, and that Rome had no legitimate authority over territories beyond the Roman province. The breakdown of negotiations occurred when Ariovistus demanded that Caesar withdraw from Gallic territory and recognize Germanic sovereignty over all lands east of the Saône River. This demand would have effectively created a Germanic kingdom controlling the crucial trade routes between the Mediterranean and northern Europe while positioning Germanic forces within striking distance of the Roman province. Caesar's refusal to accept these terms made military confrontation inevitable. The defeat of Ariovistus at Vosges in 58 BCE marked a crucial turning point that triggered massive demographic upheavals across Germanic territories, fundamentally reshaping the political landscape of Central Europe for generations to come. The collapse of Germanic power in Gaul sent shockwaves throughout the Suebi Confederation, prompting large-scale population movements as tribal leaders reassessed their strategic positions and sought new territories beyond Roman reach. These migrations, occurring primarily during the 1st century BCE, represented one of the most significant demographic transformations in European prehistory, involving hundreds of thousands of people and permanently altering the ethnic composition of vast regions from Bohemia to the Carpathian Basin. The most consequential of these population movements involved the Marcomanni tribe under the leadership of Maroboduus, a Germanic king whose political acumen and military capabilities rivaled those of his Roman contemporaries. To escape Roman aggression in 9 BC, they migrated east to Bohemia, where under their king Maroboduus, they built a powerful confederation of tribes. Archaeological evidence from sites along the main river valley indicates that Marcomanni communities had maintained settlements in this region for several generations before their dramatic relocation. Excavations at Staffelberg and other fortified hilltop sites reveal extensive defensive preparations dating to the late 2nd century BCE, suggesting that Marcomanni leaders had long anticipated the need for territorial reorganization in response to Roman expansion. Maroboduus himself possessed an unusual background for a Germanic leader, having spent his youth as a hostage in Rome, where he received education in Roman military tactics, political organization, and diplomatic protocols. This experience provided him with intimate knowledge of Roman strengths and weaknesses, enabling him to develop strategies that effectively countered traditional Roman advantages while exploiting Germanic military capabilities. The king's decision to relocate the entire Marcomanni population to Bohemia represented a masterpiece of strategic planning that required years of preparation and coordination. Intelligence networks established throughout Central Europe identified Bohemia as an ideal location for Germanic settlement, offering fertile agricultural lands, defensible mountain barriers, and strategic position controlling major trade routes between the Danube and Elbe River systems. The region's existing Celtic population, primarily composed of Boii tribal groups, had been weakened by internal conflicts and pressure from expanding Germanic peoples, creating opportunities for determined invaders. Marcomanni migration into Bohemia began around 9 BCE with advanced parties of warriors and scouts who established fortified bases at key strategic locations throughout the region. These initial settlements, identified through archaeological excavations at sites near modern Prague and Stratonus, show evidence of rapid construction using Germanic building techniques adapted to local materials and terrain. The fortifications featured distinctive timber and earth ramparts, deep defensive ditches, and wooden palisades that could be quickly erected using readily available forest resources. The main Marcomanni migration followed established river routes, with tribal groups traveling along the Main and Danube valleys in organized columns that included warriors, families, livestock, and essential supplies. Archaeological evidence from temporary campsites along these routes reveals the sophisticated logistics required for such massive population movement. Storage pits, temporary shelters, and refused deposits indicate that the migration proceeded in stages, with extended stops at predetermined locations where advanced parties had prepared supplies and established defensive positions. The displacement of Celtic populations from Bohemia occurred through a combination of military conquest, political negotiation, and demographic pressure that gradually transformed the region's ethnic composition. The boy, who had dominated Bohemian territories for centuries, found themselves unable to resist coordinated Germanic pressure while simultaneously dealing with Roman expansion along their southern borders. Archaeological evidence from major Celtic oppida such as Zavist and Trisov shows signs of violent destruction followed by Germanic occupation, indicating that military conquest played a significant role in the territorial transfer. However, the process was not entirely destructive, as Maroboduus demonstrated considerable political skill in incorporating useful elements of Celtic society into his emerging kingdom. Celtic craftsmen, particularly metalworkers and artisans skilled in advanced techniques, were often retained and integrated into Germanic communities where their expertise contributed to economic development. Celtic agricultural practices, including advanced crop rotation methods and livestock management techniques, were adopted by Germanic settlers who recognized their effectiveness in Bohemian environmental conditions. The establishment of the Marcomannic Kingdom in Bohemia created a new political entity that fundamentally altered the balance of power in Central Europe. Maroboduus organized his kingdom along lines that combined traditional Germanic tribal structures with innovations borrowed from both Roman and Celtic models. The king maintained direct control over military affairs and foreign relations while delegating administrative responsibilities to trusted subordinates who governed distinct territorial regions. The capital of the Marcomannic Kingdom, likely located near modern Prague, developed into a major urban center that rivaled contemporary Roman cities in size and sophistication. Archaeological excavations reveal extensive craft workshops, storage facilities, administrative buildings, and residential areas that housed populations numbering in the tens of thousands. The city featured planned street layouts, centralized water management systems, and specialized districts for different economic activities that demonstrated advanced urban planning capabilities. Marcomannic military organization reflected Maroboduus's Roman education while incorporating Germanic warrior traditions and tactical innovations. The king established a professional army of approximately 70,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry supported by extensive logistics networks and training facilities throughout his kingdom. These forces received standardized equipment, regular training, and systematic indoctrination that created military capabilities superior to traditional Germanic war bands, while maintaining the individual courage and tactical flexibility that characterized Germanic warfare. The kingdom's strategic position in Bohemia provided enormous advantages for both defensive and offensive operations. The surrounding mountain ranges created natural barriers that channeled potential invaders through easily defended passes, while the region's river systems provided transportation networks that facilitated rapid movement of troops and supplies. Control over these routes also generated substantial revenue through trade taxation and tribute collection from merchants traveling between northern and southern European markets. The relationship between Rome and other Germanic tribes emerged gradually as Maroboduus navigated the complex diplomatic challenges of his strategic position. Roman leaders recognized that the kingdom's military capabilities and territorial extent made direct conquest extremely costly, while its geographic location made it a valuable ally for controlling other Germanic peoples. Maroboduus exploited this situation by maintaining carefully balanced relationships with both Roman authorities and Germanic tribal leaders, extracting concessions from each side while avoiding commitments that might provoke decisive action. Diplomatic correspondence preserved in Roman sources reveals the sophisticated nature of Marcomannic foreign policy during this period. Maroboduus maintained permanent embassies at Rome, exchanged hostages with Roman authorities, and participated in complex negotiations regarding territorial boundaries and trade agreements. Simultaneously, he cultivated relationships with other Germanic leaders, offering military assistance, political asylum, and economic opportunities that expanded his influence throughout Central Europe. The transformation of Central European demographics accelerated as the success of the Marcomannic Kingdom encouraged additional Germanic migrations into formerly Celtic territories. The Quadi tribe, closely related to the Marcomanni, established settlements in modern Slovakia and eastern Austria, displacing local Celtic populations and creating a continuous Germanic presence along the Middle Danube frontier. Archaeological evidence from Quadi settlements shows rapid adoption of Marcomannic political and military innovations, suggesting close coordination between these related peoples. The Hermunduri, another major Suebi tribe, secured territories along the upper Main and Sala rivers, establishing control over crucial trade routes connecting the Rhine and Elbe River systems. Their settlements featured extensive fortifications, craft workshops, and storage facilities that supported both military operations and commercial activities. Hermunduri leaders maintained diplomatic relations with both the Marcomannic kingdom and Roman authorities, often serving as intermediaries in negotiations between these major powers. By the 2nd century CE, the complex political arrangements that had maintained relative stability along the Danube frontier began to unravel under multiple pressures that neither Roman diplomacy nor Germanic leadership could adequately address. The resulting Marcomannic Wars, spanning from 166 to 180 CE during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, represented not merely a frontier conflict, but a civilizational collision that tested the limits of both Roman imperial resources and Germanic confederation unity. The immediate catalyst for renewed hostilities emerged from environmental and demographic pressures that had been building throughout the early 2nd century CE. Climate data reconstructed from tree ring analysis and pollen studies indicates a significant cooling period beginning around 150 CE, accompanied by increased precipitation and shortened growing seasons that reduced agricultural productivity across Central Europe. These climatic changes particularly affected the marginal agricultural lands that many Germanic tribes had occupied during their earlier territorial expansions, forcing communities to seek alternative sources of sustenance and creating competition for more productive territories. Archaeological evidence from settlement sites throughout Bohemia and the Carpathian Basin reveals widespread abandonment of marginal agricultural areas during this period, with populations concentrating in river valleys and areas with more reliable water sources. Storage pit complexes show decreased grain reserves, while refuse deposits indicate dietary changes that included increased consumption of wild foods and reduced livestock holdings. These material indicators suggest that Germanic communities faced genuine subsistence crises that traditional coping mechanisms could not adequately address. The situation deteriorated dramatically with the arrival of the Antonine Plague around 165 CE, a pandemic that devastated populations throughout the Roman Empire and adjacent territories. Contemporary sources describe symptoms consistent with smallpox or measles, diseases to which Germanic populations would have had limited immunity. The plague spread rapidly along trade routes and military supply lines, affecting both Roman frontier garrisons and Germanic communities, with devastating mortality rates that disrupted normal social and economic functions. Roman military records indicate that frontier legions lost between 20 and 30% of their effective strength to disease during the initial plague outbreak, severely compromising their ability to maintain border security. Germanic communities suffered comparable losses, but the disease's impact proved particularly destabilizing for their political structures, which depended heavily on personal relationships between leaders and followers. The death of established chiefs and war leaders created succession crises that fragmented tribal unity and encouraged ambitious individuals to seek solutions through external conquest. The convergence of these environmental and demographic pressures created unprecedented challenges for the traditional diplomatic arrangements that had maintained peace along the Danube frontier. The Marcomannic kingdom, which had served as a crucial buffer state between Rome and other Germanic peoples, found itself unable to manage the competing demands of refugee populations, reduced agricultural productivity, and weakened military capabilities. King Bolomar, who had assumed leadership of the Marcomanni around 160 CE, faced the impossible task of maintaining internal stability while managing external pressures from both Roman authorities and displaced Germanic groups seeking new territories. Bolomar possessed considerable military experience and political acumen, having served in his youth as a hostage at Rome, where he observed imperial administrative methods and military organization. His understanding of Roman capabilities and limitations enabled him to develop strategies that exploited Roman weaknesses while maximizing Germanic advantages. However, the scale of the crisis facing his kingdom exceeded the capacity of traditional Germanic political institutions to provide effective solutions, forcing him to consider increasingly desperate measures. The initial phase of Germanic pressure manifested through increased raiding activity along the Danube frontier as tribal groups sought to acquire resources necessary for survival through military action. These raids differed significantly from earlier sporadic attacks, demonstrating coordinated planning and strategic objectives that suggested central direction. Roman frontier commanders reported simultaneous attacks at multiple points along the border, indicating that Germanic leaders had developed sophisticated intelligence networks and communication systems that enabled coordinated military operations across vast distances. Archaeological evidence from Roman frontier installations shows extensive damage and hasty repairs during this period, with many auxiliary forts abandoned and their garrisons concentrated in larger, more defensible positions. The transformation of sporadic raiding into systematic invasion occurred gradually during 166 and 167 CE, as Germanic leaders recognized that Roman military responses remained limited and uncoordinated. The plague's impact on frontier defenses created opportunities that ambitious Germanic commanders could not ignore, while the desperate circumstances of their own populations provided justification for increasingly aggressive actions. The Langobardi and Obi tribes initiated the first major breakthrough across the Danube frontier in late 167 CE, penetrating Roman defenses in Pannonia and advancing toward the provincial capital at Carnuntum. These tribes, displaced from their traditional territories by demographic pressure and environmental degradation, brought with them not only warriors but entire populations seeking permanent settlement in Roman territory. Their invasion force included an estimated 6,000 warriors accompanied by families, livestock, and essential supplies, indicating their intention to establish permanent settlements rather than conduct temporary raids. Roman responses to this initial invasion revealed the extent to which imperial military capabilities had been compromised by the ongoing plague and competing strategic priorities. The governor of Pannonia, Marcus Aurelius Bassus, commanded only 2 depleted legions and several auxiliary units that lacked the strength to confront the Germanic invasion force directly. His attempts to negotiate with Germanic leaders proved unsuccessful as the invaders recognized Roman weakness and pressed their advantages through continued military pressure. The situation deteriorated rapidly when additional Germanic groups, encouraged by Langobardi and Obi successes, began their own invasions across different sections of the frontier. The Marcomanni under Balamar's direct leadership crossed the Danube in early 168 CE with a force estimated at 40,000 warriors, representing the largest Germanic military operation since Ariovistus's campaigns in Gaul. This invasion force demonstrated sophisticated organization, with specialized units for siege warfare, cavalry operations, and logistical support that indicated careful planning and preparation. Balamar's strategic objectives extended beyond simple raiding to include the establishment of permanent Germanic settlements in Roman territory and the negotiation of favorable territorial arrangements that would provide long-term solutions to his people's demographic and environmental challenges. His forces advanced systematically through Pannonia, avoiding heavily fortified positions while seizing control of agricultural areas, transportation networks, and population centers that could support sustained military operations. The Quadi, traditional allies of the Marcomanni, launched simultaneous operations in the eastern sectors of the frontier, coordinating their movements with Marcomanni forces to prevent Roman commanders from concentrating their defensive efforts. Quadi cavalry, renowned for their mobility and tactical skills, conducted deep penetration raids that disrupted Roman communications and supply lines while gathering intelligence about imperial military dispositions and capabilities. The most serious crisis occurred in late 168 CE when combined Marcomanni and Quadi forces advanced beyond the Alps and threatened Aquileia, a major commercial center and strategic gateway to northern Italy. Contemporary sources describe widespread panic among Roman populations as news of Germanic advances reached Rome itself, creating fears that barbarian armies might march on the imperial capital as they had during the Cimbri invasions 3 centuries earlier. However, Archaeological evidence and careful analysis of contemporary accounts indicate that while Germanic forces did advance to within striking distance of Aquileia, they did not actually besiege the city, instead focusing their efforts on securing control over agricultural territories and transportation routes in the surrounding regions. The Germanic advance toward Aquileia represented the culmination of a carefully planned strategic operation designed to force Roman authorities to negotiate favorable territorial arrangements rather than achieve military conquest of Roman territory. Roman military responses to the Germanic threat required fundamental changes in imperial strategic priorities and resource allocation. Marcus Aurelius initiated massive recruitment efforts throughout the empire, raising new legions and auxiliary units, while recalling veteran forces from other frontier regions. These mobilization efforts strained imperial finances and disrupted established military arrangements, but provided the manpower necessary for sustained operations against Germanic forces. The emperor's military strategy evolved from defensive containment to systematic offensive operations designed to drive Germanic forces back across the Danube and establish conditions for lasting peace. This strategic shift required careful coordination between multiple army groups operating across vast territories, sophisticated logistical planning to support extended campaigns, and diplomatic initiatives to prevent additional Germanic tribes from joining the existing coalition. Germanic military tactics during the early phases of the conflict demonstrated significant evolution from traditional tribal warfare methods, incorporating innovations learned through contact with Roman military practices and adaptation to the specific challenges of operating in Roman territory. Balimar's forces employed coordinated infantry and cavalry operations, systematic siege techniques, and strategic deception that indicated professional military planning and execution. Roman counteroffensives beginning in 169 CE demonstrated the empire's capacity to mobilize overwhelming military resources once imperial authorities recognized the full scope of the Germanic threat. Marcus Aurelius assembled forces totaling over 100,000 men, including regular legions, auxiliary units, and allied barbarian contingents, creating the largest Roman army deployed against Germanic peoples since Caesar's Gallic campaigns. The emperor's campaign strategy emphasized systematic reduction of Germanic strongholds, destruction of their logistical infrastructure, and coordination with diplomatic initiatives designed to fragment the Germanic coalition. These operations required careful planning and execution as Germanic forces retained significant advantages in mobility and local knowledge that could be exploited against overextended Roman advances. The war lasted until Aurelius's death in 180. The prolonged nature of the conflict demonstrated both Roman determination to maintain frontier security and Germanic resilience in defending their newly acquired territories. Archaeological evidence from the war zone reveals the devastating impact of 14 years of sustained warfare on both civilian populations and military forces, with widespread destruction of settlements, systematic exploitation of agricultural resources, and massive population displacements that affected the demographic composition of Central Europe for generations. The resolution of the Marcomannic Wars established new patterns of Roman-Germanic relations that would influence frontier policies throughout the remainder of the imperial period. Rather than attempting to conquer and directly administer Germanic territories, Roman authorities increasingly relied on client relationships, tributary arrangements, and buffer states that could provide security while minimizing the costs and risks associated with extended frontier defense. The true strength of the Suebi Confederation had always lain not merely in their military capabilities, but in the sophisticated internal structures that had evolved over centuries to govern their vast territories and diverse populations. The hierarchical organization of Suebi society reflected a complex balance between traditional Germanic egalitarianism and the practical necessities of governing large territorial confederations. At the apex of this structure stood the kings, whose authority derived from a combination of hereditary legitimacy, military prowess, and religious sanction that distinguished them from mere war leaders or tribal chiefs. Archaeological evidence from royal burial sites, particularly the elaborate grave complexes discovered at Musov in Moravia, reveals the material symbols of kingly authority that included gold torques, ceremonial weapons, imported Roman luxury goods, and distinctive regalia that proclaimed royal status to both subjects and foreign observers. Suebi kingship operated within carefully defined parameters that prevented the emergence of absolute monarchy while ensuring effective leadership during times of crisis. Kings possessed ultimate authority over military operations, foreign relations, and major judicial decisions, but their power was constrained by traditional laws, tribal assemblies, and the expectations of the warrior aristocracy who formed the backbone of Germanic political organization. The warrior aristocracy formed the second tier of Suebi's social hierarchy, comprising individuals who had distinguished themselves through military service, accumulated wealth through successful raiding or trading ventures, or inherited elevated status through family connections. This aristocratic class, numbering perhaps 5 to 10% of the total population, controlled most agricultural land, maintained private military retinues, and exercised judicial authority over local disputes. Tribal assemblies represented the third crucial element of Suebi governance, providing forums for collective decision-making that balanced royal authority with popular participation. These assemblies, called by kings or senior aristocrats during times of crisis or for major policy decisions, brought together free adult males from throughout tribal territories to debate issues affecting the entire community. Religious practices permeated every aspect of Suebi's social organization, providing ideological justification for political hierarchies while maintaining cultural unity across diverse territorial holdings. The Suebi worshipped a pantheon of Germanic deities whose characteristics reflected the military values and natural environment that shaped their society. Woden, the chief deity, served as patron of warriors and kings, providing divine sanction for military leadership while demanding tribute in the form of battlefield sacrifices and ceremonial offerings. Sacred groves formed the focal points of Suebi religious practice, serving as temples, assembly sites, and repositories for tribal treasures that could not be housed in conventional structures. These groves, typically located in ancient forest clearings surrounded by massive oak trees, provided settings for seasonal festivals, initiation ceremonies, and major religious observances that brought together participants from throughout tribal territories. Economic foundations of Suebi society rested primarily on mixed agricultural systems that combined crop cultivation with animal husbandry to provide subsistence for dense populations while generating surpluses for trade and tribute. Archaeological evidence from settlement sites throughout Suebi territories reveals sophisticated farming techniques that maximized productivity while maintaining soil fertility through crop rotation, selective breeding, and careful resource management. Trade networks connected Suebi territories with commercial systems that extended from the Baltic Sea to the Mediterranean, facilitating exchange of local products for exotic goods that enhanced the material culture of Germanic communities. The most famous of these trade routes involved amber from Baltic coastal regions, which Suebi merchants transported southward through established river valleys to Roman and Celtic markets where it commanded premium prices. Legal traditions among the Suebi reflected the complex balance between individual rights and collective responsibilities that characterized Germanic society. Traditional law, preserved through oral tradition and administered by assemblies of free men, emphasized compensation rather than punishment for most offenses, seeking to restore social harmony rather than exact retribution. However, by the early 3rd century CE, these traditional structures faced unprecedented challenges as demographic pressures, Roman military reforms, and internal political tensions converged to fragment the once unified confederation. The emergence of the Alemanni from this fragmentation represented not merely a political reorganization, but a fundamental transformation in Germanic identity and territorial ambitions that would reshape the western frontiers of the Roman Empire for centuries to come. The Alemanni Confederation crystallized during the tumultuous decades following the Antonine Plague and the Marcomannic Wars, drawing together displaced Suebi populations who had been scattered by Roman military campaigns and territorial disruptions. Archaeological evidence from sites along the Upper Rhine and Upper Danube reveals significant population movements during the late 2nd and early 3rd century CE, with established settlement patterns abandoned and new communities formed in previously marginal territories. The name Alemanni itself, meaning all men in the Germanic dialects of the period, reflected the composite nature of this emerging confederation. Unlike earlier Suebi formations that developed around established tribal cores with shared ancestry and territorial traditions, the Alemanni represented a conscious alliance of diverse groups united primarily by common circumstances and shared objectives rather than ethnic homogeneity. The Semnones, once among the most prestigious tribes within the broader Suebi Confederation, formed the largest single component of the emerging Alemanni alliance. Their traditional territories between the Elbe and Oder rivers had been severely disrupted by Roman campaigns during the Marcomannic Wars, forcing large portions of their population to migrate westward in search of new lands. The formation of the Alemanni Confederation coincided with a period of Roman military and political crisis that created unprecedented opportunities for Germanic expansion. The assassination of Emperor Commodus in 192 CE initiated a period of civil war and political instability that diverted Roman attention and resources from frontier defense to internal conflicts. The subsequent reign of Septimius Severus saw extensive military campaigns in Britain, Mesopotamia, and other distant theaters that stripped the Rhine frontier of experienced legions and auxiliary units, leaving border defenses in the hands of local militias and depleted garrison forces. The Alemanni's first major military operations targeted the Roman limes along the Upper Rhine, where decades of peace had created a false sense of security among frontier communities. These initial attacks, beginning around 213 CE during the reign of Caracalla, demonstrated sophisticated planning and coordination that indicated central command authority rather than spontaneous tribal raiding. Archaeological excavations at attacked sites reveal evidence of systematic destruction focused on military installations and administrative centers, suggesting strategic objectives beyond mere plunder acquisition. The breakthrough into the Agri-Decumates region represented the culmination of decades of Alemanni pressure and the collapse of Roman frontier defenses under sustained Germanic assault. This fertile territory between the Rhine and Danube rivers had been systematically colonized by Rome during the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, with veteran settlements, agricultural estates, and commercial centers creating a prosperous province that generated substantial revenues for the imperial treasury. The loss of this region to Germanic conquest represented not merely a military defeat, but an economic catastrophe that weakened Roman capabilities throughout the Western Empire. Archaeological evidence from the Agri-Decumates reveals the systematic nature of Alemanni conquest and settlement during the mid-3rd century CE. Roman villas and urban centers show evidence of violent destruction followed by Germanic occupation, with Roman building techniques adapted for Germanic purposes and Roman infrastructure maintained for continued use. This pattern suggests that Alemanni leaders understood the economic value of conquered territories and possessed the administrative capabilities necessary to exploit Roman developments rather than simply destroying them. The speed of Alemanni advance through the Agri-Decumates caught Roman authorities completely unprepared, with entire legions abandoning their positions rather than face annihilation by overwhelming Germanic forces. Contemporary sources describe panic among Roman provincial populations as news of Germanic victories spread throughout Gaul and the Rhineland, creating refugee movements that further disrupted imperial administration and military organization. Alemanni settlement patterns in conquered territories reflected their composite origins and the practical necessities of governing diverse populations across extensive territorial holdings. Rather than imposing uniform cultural practices, Alemanni leaders allowed constituent tribal groups to maintain their distinctive customs and social organization while requiring military service and tribute payments to Confederation authorities. The establishment of permanent agricultural communities represented a fundamental shift in Germanic economic organization that enabled sustained territorial occupation rather than temporary military conquest. Alemanni settlers adapted Roman agricultural techniques to their own needs, maintaining villa estates and field systems while introducing Germanic livestock breeds and crop varieties that proved better suited to local environmental conditions. The integration of Roman and Germanic agricultural practices created highly productive farming systems that supported growing populations while generating surpluses for trade and military purposes. Alemanni farmers adopted Roman techniques for crop rotation, soil improvement, and livestock management while maintaining Germanic traditions of communal land ownership and seasonal labor exchange. Craft production in Alemanni territories combined Roman technical knowledge with Germanic artistic traditions to create distinctive material cultures that reflected Confederation identity. Metalwork, particularly iron production and weapon manufacture, reached high levels of sophistication as Germanic smiths learned Roman techniques, while maintaining traditional decorative styles and functional designs. The relationship between the Alemanni Confederation and other Germanic peoples evolved through complex processes of competition, alliance, and territorial negotiation that reflected the fluid nature of Central European politics during the 3rd century CE. The Franks, emerging as a powerful confederation along the Lower Rhine, represented both potential allies and dangerous competitors for territorial control and Roman tribute payments. Meanwhile, the transformation of Central European demographics during the 3rd and 4th centuries created new patterns of cultural interaction and political organization that would influence European development for centuries to come. Among these developments, the evolution of the Quadi kingdom in the fertile plains of modern-day Slovakia represented perhaps the most sophisticated attempt by Suebi peoples to create a stable political entity capable of managing complex relationships with both Roman imperial authorities and other Germanic confederations. The Quadi transformation from traditional tribal confederation to centralized monarchy occurred gradually during the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, driven by territorial pressures, demographic changes, and the practical necessities of governing sedentary populations in strategically crucial frontier regions. Archaeological evidence from major Quadi centers, particularly the extensive settlement complexes near modern Bratislava and Nitra, reveals systematic urban development that incorporated Roman architectural techniques with Germanic social organization principles. The Quadi royal residence at Trenčín, identified through extensive excavations, demonstrates the material foundations of Germanic kingship during this transformative period. The complex featured a massive timber and stone hall capable of accommodating over 500 participants for royal assemblies and ceremonial feasts, surrounded by smaller buildings that housed the royal household, administrative officials, craft specialists, and military retainers. The development of Quadi political institutions during the 4th century CE reflected their evolving relationship with Roman imperial authorities and their need to manage internal affairs across territories that included both Germanic settlers and indigenous populations. The kingdom's administrative structure combined traditional Germanic assemblies with appointed officials who managed specific territorial districts, collected tribute payments, and coordinated military obligations. The transformation of the Quadi into Roman federati during the late 4th century CE represented a calculated political decision that provided immediate benefits while creating long-term obligations that would fundamentally alter their relationship with the Roman Empire. The federati arrangement, formalized during negotiations with Emperor Theodosius I around 380 CE, granted the Quadi official recognition as allied peoples within the imperial system while requiring military service in support of Roman strategic objectives. This agreement provided the Quadi with legal protection for their territorial holdings, access to Roman markets and technical expertise, and formal diplomatic status that enhanced their prestige among other Germanic peoples. Archaeological evidence from the period immediately following the Federati Agreement reveals significant changes in Quadi material culture that reflect their new political status and increased contact with Roman authorities. The military obligations imposed by Federati status required the Quadi to provide troops for Roman campaigns throughout the empire, creating opportunities for cultural exchange while generating tensions within traditional Germanic social structures. Quadi warriors served in Roman expeditions to Britain, Gaul, Italy, and the eastern provinces, gaining experience with Roman military techniques while maintaining their distinctive fighting styles and cultural practices. Diplomatic marriages between Quadi royal families and Roman aristocratic houses represented another crucial aspect of the Federati relationship that created personal bonds while serving broader political objectives. These marriages, typically involving Quadi princesses and Roman military commanders or provincial governors, established kinship networks that facilitated communication and cooperation while providing both sides with valuable intelligence about their partners' intentions and capabilities. The relationship between the Quadi kingdom and the emerging Hunnic Empire under Attila represented one of the most challenging diplomatic and military situations that Germanic peoples faced during the 5th century CE. The Huns' arrival in Central Europe around 370 CE created unprecedented pressures on established Germanic political arrangements, forcing leaders like the Quadi to choose between resistance and accommodation while managing the internal tensions that these decisions created within their own societies. Initial contacts between the Quadi and Hunnic forces occurred during the 380 CE when Hunnic raiders began probing Germanic territories along the Middle Danube frontier. These early encounters, documented through archaeological evidence of destroyed settlements and hastily constructed fortifications, reveal the extent of Hunnic military capabilities and their systematic approach to territorial conquest. King Gabinius's response to Hunnic pressure involved a complex combination of military preparation, diplomatic negotiation, and strategic alliance building that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the changing political landscape in Central Europe. Archaeological evidence from fortification projects initiated during this period shows systematic defensive planning that incorporated lessons learned from early Hunnic attacks while adapting Roman siege defense techniques to Germanic needs. The diplomatic negotiations between Quadi leadership and Hunnic commanders revealed the pragmatic nature of 5th century political relationships and the willingness of both sides to seek accommodation when military solutions proved too costly or uncertain. The agreements reached during these discussions established tributary relationships that provided the Quadi with protection from Hunnic attacks while requiring regular payments of tribute in goods, services, and military assistance. The impact of Hunnic overlordship on Quadi political structures proved both transformative and destabilizing, forcing adaptations in traditional governance methods while creating new sources of internal tension and external obligation. The requirement to provide tribute payments to Hunnic authorities necessitated increased taxation of Quadi subjects, systematic resource extraction from conquered territories, and careful management of trade relationships that could generate necessary revenues. The gradual dissolution of distinct Quadi identity during the later 5th and early 6th centuries CE reflected broader patterns of political fragmentation and cultural transformation that characterized the migration period throughout Central Europe. The collapse of Hunnic power following Attila's death in 453 CE created opportunities for Germanic peoples to reassert their independence, but also eliminated the external pressure that had maintained unity among diverse tribal groups within established confederations. The integration of former Quadi territories and populations into other tribal confederations occurred through complex processes of negotiation, conquest, and voluntary association that reflected the fluid nature of Germanic political identity during the migration period. Some Quadi groups joined the expanding Lombard kingdom, bringing their military expertise and territorial knowledge to support Lombard expansion into Italy. Others associated themselves with emerging Bavarian tribal confederations, contributing to the ethnogenesis of new Germanic peoples that would dominate Central European politics during the early medieval period. But perhaps the most dramatic transformation of Suebi identity occurred far from their traditional heartlands, along the windswept Atlantic coast of northwestern Iberia. The great barbarian invasions of 409 CE created unprecedented opportunities for Germanic peoples to establish permanent kingdoms within former Roman territories. And among these movements, the Suebi migration into Galatia represented one of the most successful attempts to create a stable Germanic monarchy on the periphery of the crumbling Western Roman Empire. The migration itself began during the harsh winter of 406 to 407 CE, when the frozen Rhine River provided a natural bridge for massive Germanic populations fleeing Hunnic pressure in Central Europe. Archaeological evidence from abandoned settlement sites throughout modern Germany reveals systematic evacuation procedures, with valuable items carefully buried in hidden caches and temporary structures dismantled for transport, indicating organized relocation rather than panicked flight. The Suebi groups participating in this westward movement included remnants of traditional tribal confederations whose territories had been disrupted by decades of warfare and political upheaval. The Suebi forces that crossed into Gaul numbered approximately 80,000 people, including warriors, families, livestock, and essential supplies packed onto thousands of wagons that stretched for miles along Roman roads. The alliance between Suebi, Vandal, and Allan peoples during their passage through Gaul reflected pragmatic political calculations rather than ethnic solidarity, as each group possessed complementary military capabilities that enhanced their collective survival prospects. The Vandals provided experienced infantry forces and siege expertise gained through decades of conflict with Roman armies, while the Alans contributed superior cavalry units and knowledge of steppe warfare tactics that proved invaluable during encounters with Roman forces. The three-year devastation of Gaul between 407 and 409 CE created conditions that facilitated barbarian passage while demonstrating the collapse of Roman frontier defenses throughout the western provinces. Archaeological excavations at sites throughout modern France reveal extensive destruction layers from this period, with Roman villas burned, urban centers abandoned, and defensive installations systematically dismantled by barbarian forces. The decision to cross the Pyrenees into Hispania occurred after negotiations with Roman usurper Constantine III, who controlled much of Gaul and sought barbarian military assistance for his campaigns against legitimate imperial authorities. Archaeological evidence from mountain pass sites shows extensive earthworks and temporary fortifications that indicate systematic preparation for the crossing, with advanced parties establishing supply depots and defensive positions that protected the main migration columns during their vulnerable passage through the mountain defile. The initial barbarian settlement in Hispania followed agreements mediated by Roman authorities who sought to use barbarian military power to restore imperial control over rebellious provinces. The Suebi received territorial assignments in Galicia, the northwestern region that encompassed modern Galicia and northern Portugal, along with portions of modern Leon and Asturias. This territory, while peripheral to Roman strategic interests, possessed significant agricultural potential and mineral resources that could support substantial populations while providing defensible mountain barriers against external threats. King Hermeric emerged as the paramount leader of the Suebi during the early phases of settlement, demonstrating the political and military capabilities necessary to coordinate diverse tribal groups while establishing relationships with Roman authorities and local Hispanic populations. Archaeological evidence from early Suebi settlements shows systematic land distribution, organized construction projects, and evidence of agricultural intensification that indicates effective leadership and administrative coordination. The establishment of Braga as the Suebi capital represented a calculated decision that balanced strategic, economic, and cultural considerations essential for long-term political stability. The city's location at the intersection of major Roman roads provided access to both Atlantic ports and interior territories, while its existing urban infrastructure offered immediate administrative capabilities that could be adapted to Germanic needs. The transformation of Roman urban centers for Germanic use required innovative architectural solutions that accommodated different cultural practices while preserving functional efficiency. Suebi modifications to Roman buildings typically involved the installation of central hearths in former dining rooms, the subdivision of large spaces into smaller family quarters, and the conversion of commercial areas into craft workshops that served Germanic economic needs. Suebi territorial organization in Galicia reflected their traditional confederation structure adapted to the realities of governing sedentary populations across extensive geographic regions. The kingdom was divided into several major districts, each controlled by a prominent noble family responsible for local administration, military recruitment, and tribute collection. The integration of Hispanic populations into Suebi political structures occurred through complex processes of negotiation, intermarriage, and cultural adaptation that created new synthetic identities combining Germanic and Roman traditions. Archaeological evidence from mixed settlements shows gradual changes in material culture, with Hispanic pottery styles incorporating Germanic decorative motifs, while Germanic metalwork adopted Roman technical innovations. Military organization within the Suebi kingdom combined traditional Germanic warrior bands with Roman tactical innovations and Hispanic knowledge of local terrain and defensive strategies. The royal army maintained approximately 15,000 professional warriors organized into units based on tribal origins, while territorial militias provided additional manpower for defensive operations and local security. The development of Suebi naval capabilities represented a remarkable adaptation to their new maritime environment, as Germanic peoples traditionally possessed limited experience with ocean navigation and naval warfare. Archaeological evidence from coastal settlements shows the construction of harbors, shipbuilding facilities, and navigational aids that enabled Suebi forces to project power along the Atlantic coast while maintaining commercial relationships with Mediterranean trading networks. Conflicts with the Visigothic kingdom emerged gradually as both Germanic peoples expanded their territorial control and competed for dominance over the Iberian Peninsula. The Visigoths, established in southern Gaul and eastern Hispania, possessed superior military resources and more extensive Roman administrative experience, but the Suebi advantages in their mountainous territories and alliance with local populations created a rough balance of power that prevented decisive victory by either side. The most significant military confrontation occurred in 456 CE, when Visigothic King Theodoric II launched a major invasion of Suebi territory in response to Suebi raids into Visigothic-controlled regions. The campaign culminated in the Battle of the Orbigo River, where Suebi forces under King Reciarius suffered a devastating defeat that temporarily reduced the kingdom to tributary status under Visigothic overlordship. The recovery of Suebi independence under King Remismund during the 460s CE demonstrated the resilience of Germanic political institutions and the effectiveness of mountain warfare tactics against conventional military forces. Remismund's strategy emphasized guerrilla operations, fortified strongholds, and alliance building with local Hispanic populations who resented Visigothic taxation and administrative interference. The conversion of the Suebi to Arian Christianity during the reign of King Remismund marked a crucial turning point in the kingdom's cultural development and its relationship with other Germanic peoples. The adoption of Arianism, mediated through contacts with Visigothic missionaries and political advisors, provided the Suebi with access to a sophisticated theological tradition while distinguishing them from Catholic Hispanic populations and Roman authorities. The establishment of Arian ecclesiastical hierarchy within the Suebi kingdom required careful negotiation between Germanic political traditions and Christian administrative requirements. Arian bishops, typically drawn from prominent noble families, assumed responsibilities for spiritual guidance, legal interpretation, and diplomatic communication that complemented rather than competed with royal authority. Cultural transformation within Suebi society accelerated during the late 5th and early 6th century CE as Christian influences combined with Roman administrative practices and Hispanic cultural traditions to create distinctive synthetic identities. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals significant changes in burial practices, with traditional Germanic cremation gradually replaced by Christian inhumation, while grave goods evolved to include Christian symbols alongside traditional Germanic ornaments. The conversion from Arianism to Catholic Christianity under King Reciarius around 560 CE represented far more than a simple change in theological doctrine. It fundamentally restructured social hierarchies, legal systems, and cultural practices while creating new forms of political legitimacy that would define the kingdom's relationship with both its subjects and neighboring powers. The transformation occurred through the dedicated efforts of St. Martin of Braga, a Pannonian monk whose sophisticated understanding of both classical learning and popular religious practices enabled him to develop highly effective methods for promoting Catholic orthodoxy among Germanic populations. Martin arrived in Galatia around 550 CE with extensive theological training acquired at monasteries throughout the eastern Mediterranean, where he had studied Greek patristic literature, participated in theological debates over Christological controversies, and observed diverse approaches to Christian missionary work among non-Roman populations. The saint's approach to Suebi conversion emphasized intellectual persuasion rather than political coercion, recognizing that lasting religious transformation required genuine conviction rather than mere compliance with royal decrees. Martin composed theological treatises specifically designed to address Arian arguments, while demonstrating the compatibility of Catholic Christianity with Germanic cultural values. The conversion of King Reciarius and the Suebi royal court created the political conditions necessary for systematic religious transformation throughout the kingdom, but the process required careful management of competing interests and traditional loyalties that could not be ignored without risking political instability. The king's public conversion ceremony, conducted by Martin of Braga in the cathedral at Braga around 560 CE, incorporated both Catholic liturgical requirements and Germanic ceremonial traditions that proclaimed royal authority while demonstrating submission to divine will. The establishment of Catholic ecclesiastical hierarchy within the Suebi kingdom required extensive reorganization of existing religious institutions and the training of new clergy who could implement orthodox practices while maintaining effective relationships with local populations. Martin of Braga served as the first Catholic metropolitan of Braga, assuming responsibility for coordinating religious transformation throughout the kingdom while establishing new bishoprics in major population centers. The transformation of Suebi burial practices under Catholic influence demonstrates the profound impact of religious conversion on fundamental cultural traditions that had defined Germanic identity for centuries. Traditional Germanic cremation practices, which reflected beliefs about the afterlife and the relationship between the living and the dead, were gradually replaced by Christian inhumation that emphasized bodily resurrection and eternal judgment. The construction of Christian churches within Suebi territories required innovative architectural solutions that accommodated Catholic liturgical requirements while reflecting Germanic cultural preferences and construction techniques. The earliest Catholic churches in Galatia combined Roman masonry techniques with Germanic timber framing to create distinctive religious buildings that proclaimed both Christian faith and cultural identity. However, these transformations that had strengthened Suebi cultural identity and political legitimacy during the 6th century would prove insufficient to protect their independence against the rising power of the Visigothic kingdom under King Leovigild. The conquest of the Suebi kingdom of Galatia in 585 CE marked the end of the last independent Suebi political entity, concluding nearly 7 centuries of Germanic political autonomy that had begun with Caesar's encounters along the Rhine frontier. King Leovigild's campaign against the Suebi represented the culmination of decades of Visigothic territorial expansion designed to unify the entire Iberian Peninsula under a single Germanic monarchy. The Visigothic king had spent the early years of his reign consolidating control over rebellious territories, suppressing Byzantine enclaves along the Mediterranean coast, and establishing administrative systems that could govern the diverse populations of Hispania effectively. The pretext for invasion emerged from succession disputes within the Suebi kingdom following the death of King Miro in 583 CE. Miro's son Eborco assumed the throne but faced immediate challenges from rival claimants who questioned his legitimacy and sought external support for their own ambitions. The political instability created opportunities for Visigothic intervention, as Leovigild could present his military action as support for legitimate authority rather than naked territorial aggression. The Visigothic invasion began in late 584 CE with coordinated attacks along multiple fronts that demonstrated sophisticated strategic planning and overwhelming military superiority. Leovigild's forces, numbering approximately 25,000 warriors supported by extensive logistical networks, advanced simultaneously through the major mountain passes that provided access to Suebi territory. The siege of Braga, the Suebi capital, lasted only 3 months before the city's defenses collapsed under sustained Visigothic assault. Archaeological excavations within the city reveal extensive damage from this period, including burned buildings, destroyed fortifications, and mass burial sites that indicate significant casualties among both military defenders and civilian populations. King Audica, who had assumed power during the final stages of the siege through a palace coup that eliminated his rivals, attempted to negotiate terms that would preserve Suebi autonomy under Visigothic overlordship. However, Leovigild's strategic objectives required complete territorial integration rather than tributary arrangements that might encourage future rebellion. The final surrender ceremony, conducted in Braga's cathedral in early 585 CE, formally ended Suebi political independence while incorporating their territories directly into the Visigothic administrative system. Contemporary chronicles describe elaborate rituals that proclaimed Visigothic victory while attempting to minimize the humiliation of defeated Suebi nobles whose cooperation would be essential for effective governance. The integration of former Suebi territories into the Visigothic kingdom required systematic administrative reorganization that balanced the need for central control with recognition of local customs and established social hierarchies. Leovigild appointed Visigothic governors to major administrative centers while retaining many Suebi nobles in subordinate positions that utilized their knowledge of local conditions and their influence over traditional followers. The transformation of Suebi military forces following conquest involved both the incorporation of experienced warriors into Visigothic armies and the systematic disarmament of potentially rebellious populations. Suebi warriors who demonstrated loyalty to their new rulers received opportunities to serve in Visigothic military units operating throughout the kingdom, while those suspected of continued resistance faced deportation to distant territories where they could not coordinate opposition activities. The gradual disappearance of distinct Suebi identity in Galaetia occurred through processes of intermarriage, cultural adaptation, and generational change that transformed ethnic boundaries without eliminating all traces of Germanic heritage. Visigothic settlement policies encouraged intermarriage between Germanic populations as a means of creating unified cultural identity, while legal codes provided frameworks for resolving disputes between different ethnic groups during the transition period. Meanwhile, the Alemanni Suebi along the Rhine frontier faced different but equally transformative pressures from the expanding Frankish kingdom, which had emerged as the dominant power in Western Europe following its conversion to Catholic Christianity and systematic territorial expansion. The Frankish conquest of Alemanni territories occurred gradually during the 6th and 7th centuries CE through a combination of military campaigns, diplomatic pressure, and cultural assimilation that ultimately eliminated Alemanni political independence while incorporating their populations into the emerging Carolingian state system. The process of Alemanni integration into the Frankish kingdom differed significantly from the Visigothic conquest of Galaetia, reflecting the different political structures and cultural policies of the conquering powers. Frankish rulers typically maintained existing Germanic social hierarchies while requiring acknowledgement of Frankish overlordship and participation in kingdom-wide military obligations. The Christianization of Alemanni territories under Frankish influence accelerated the cultural transformation that had begun during earlier periods of missionary activity. Frankish rulers viewed the promotion of Catholic orthodoxy as essential for maintaining political unity and legitimizing their authority over diverse populations, leading to systematic efforts to eliminate remaining pagan practices while establishing comprehensive ecclesiastical hierarchies. The economic development of former Alemanni territories under Frankish rule benefited from integration into broader European trade networks, while maintaining regional specializations that reflected local resources and traditional skills. The production of high-quality metalwork, textiles, and agricultural products continued under Frankish oversight, with improved transportation networks and standardized commercial practices facilitating expanded market access. The linguistic transformation of Alemanni territories proceeded gradually as Latin administrative language combined with Germanic vernacular traditions to create distinctive regional dialects that preserved elements of both linguistic traditions. The development of written Germanic languages during the Carolingian period provided new opportunities for preserving traditional cultural knowledge while adapting to Christian theological and administrative requirements. The archaeological legacy of the Suebi throughout their former territories provides crucial evidence for understanding Germanic cultural development and the complex processes of political transformation that characterized the migration period. Excavations at major Suebi centers have revealed sophisticated urban planning, advanced craft production techniques, and complex social hierarchies that demonstrate the high level of cultural achievement attained by Germanic peoples during their period of political independence. The distribution of distinctively Suebi artifacts across modern Germany, Switzerland, Austria, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Spain, and Portugal reflects the extensive territorial reach of Suebi political influence and the complex patterns of migration and cultural exchange that characterize their historical development. Archaeological analysis of pottery styles, metalwork techniques, burial practices, and settlement patterns reveals both the unity and diversity of Suebi culture. demonstrating how shared political identity combined with regional variations that reflected local environmental conditions and cultural contacts. The linguistic legacy of the Suebi survives in place names, personal names, and vocabulary elements that were incorporated into the Romance and Germanic languages that developed in their former territories. Toponymic evidence reveals the extent of Suebi settlement patterns and provides insights into their territorial organization, while linguistic analysis of Germanic loanwords in Romance languages illuminates the processes of cultural interaction and assimilation that occurred during and after the migration period. Through 7 centuries of political evolution, military conflict, territorial expansion, and cultural transformation, the Suebi demonstrated the capacity of Germanic peoples to create sophisticated political entities, adapt to changing circumstances, and contribute to European civilization through their innovations in governance, law, military organization, and cultural synthesis. Their legacy survives not only in archaeological remains and linguistic evidence, but in the institutional and cultural foundations of medieval and modern European society that continue to reflect the complex heritage of Germanic and Roman interaction during the migration period. Yet even as the last Suebi kingdom fell to Visigothic conquest in that fateful year of 585 CE, the story of these remarkable Germanic peoples was far from over. Like seeds scattered by autumn winds across a vast landscape, the essence of Suebi culture would take root in unexpected places, germinating into new forms of identity that would influence European development for centuries to come. Their political independence may have ended, but their cultural DNA would prove far more resilient than any kingdom or confederation. In the misty highlands of Galicia, where King Audica had surrendered his crown to the triumphant Leovigild, Suebi nobles faced a choice that would define the fate of their people for generations. They could resist their new circumstances and face inevitable destruction, or they could adapt to Visigothic rule with the same pragmatic resilience that had enabled their ancestors to survive 7 centuries of warfare, migration, and constant political upheaval. Many chose the path of strategic accommodation, pursuing marriages with Visigothic aristocrats and gradually integrating themselves into the new political order while carefully preserving what they could of their ancestral heritage. The archaeological record from late 6th and 7th century burial sites throughout former Suebi territories reveals the complex nature of this cultural transformation. At the cemetery of Monte de Senhora de Guia near Bayos, excavations have uncovered burial goods that tell the story of a society in transition. Traditional Germanic grave goods, the iron swords with their distinctive pommel designs, bronze fibulae with intricate geometric patterns, and glass drinking vessels imported from Rhine workshops, were gradually replaced by Christian symbols, Roman-style jewelry incorporating Byzantine techniques, and silk textiles that reflected new sources of prestige and identity within the evolving Visigothic kingdom. The transformation was not uniform or immediate. In the mountain valleys where Suebi settlement had been particularly dense, traditional burial practices persisted well into the 7th century. Excavations at sites near modern Chaves and Vila Real reveal graves that combine Christian symbols with Germanic weapons and jewelry, suggesting that cultural identity remained fluid during the transition period. Some burials from this era include both Christian crosses and traditional Germanic amulets, indicating that religious conversion did not necessarily eliminate all connections to ancestral beliefs and practices. The monastery of San Martin de Dumio, established by Saint Martin of Braga during the final decades of Suebi independence, became perhaps the most crucial institution for preserving Germanic cultural traditions within a Christian framework. The community of monks who gathered there, many of whom descended from prominent Suebi noble families, dedicated themselves to a scholarly mission that extended far beyond simple religious observance. They recognized that the survival of their cultural heritage depended upon careful documentation and preservation of traditions that might otherwise be lost during the political transformation. In the monastery's scriptorium, working by candlelight in the hours before dawn and after Vespers, these learned monks copied manuscripts that preserved not only religious texts but also historical chronicles, legal codes, genealogical records, and poetic traditions that documented Germanic heritage. Their careful script preserved for posterity the Chronica Suevorum, a detailed account of Suebi kings and their achievements that would later prove invaluable to medieval historians seeking to understand the complex political arrangements of the migration period. Among the most precious manuscripts preserved at Dumio were genealogies that traced the lineages of prominent Suebi families back through generations of kings and warriors to the legendary figures of the migration period. These documents served immediate practical purposes for establishing inheritance rights and validating marriage alliances in the new Visigothic social order, but they also maintained cultural memory that connected 7th-century aristocrats with their heroic ancestors who had challenged Rome itself and carved kingdoms from the wilderness. The genealogy of the Remismundids, descendants of the last great Suebi king before the conversion to Catholicism, was particularly detailed and carefully maintained. This family tree, preserved in multiple copies at different monasteries, traced bloodlines that connected prominent Visigothic-era nobles with the royal house that had ruled the Suebi during their final century of independence. The document includes not only names and dates, but also brief notations about the achievements and characteristics of individual ancestors, creating a portrait of Germanic nobility that emphasized military prowess, diplomatic skill, and Christian piety as the essential virtues of leadership. The linguistic transformation of former Suebi territories proceeded through complex processes of convergence and differentiation that created distinctive regional dialects, preserving Germanic vocabulary within evolving Romance language structures. In remote mountain valleys where Suebi settlement had been particularly dense, shepherds and farmers continued to use Germanic terms for livestock, agricultural implements, and geographical features long after Latin had become the dominant language of administration and commerce. The persistence of Germanic vocabulary in pastoral activities is particularly striking in the linguistic evidence from the Miho Valley region. Terms for specific types of grazing land, methods of cattle management, and seasonal agricultural practices retained their Germanic origins well into the medieval period. The word Vega, meaning a fertile river valley suitable for agriculture, derives directly from Germanic Wega and appears throughout the region in place names and agricultural terminology that survives to this day. More subtly, Germanic syntactic structures influenced the development of Galilean Latin, creating grammatical patterns that distinguished the regional dialect from other Romance languages. The Germanic preference for verb final word order in subordinate clauses left traces in medieval Galilean that can still be detected in historical documents from the 8th and 9th centuries. These grammatical features, invisible to casual observation but significant to linguistic analysis, provide evidence of the profound impact Germanic languages had on the development of regional Romance dialects. Medieval chroniclers, writing centuries after the Visigothic conquest, occasionally reference these linguistic survivals when describing the customs of Galilean populations. The chronicler known as the Anonymous of Ravenna, writing around 700 CE, noted the persistence of Germanic personal names among rural communities where family traditions maintained connections to tribal ancestors. Names like Hermeric, Rechiarius, and Remismund, honoring the last Suebi kings, continued to appear in baptismal records well into the 8th and 9th centuries, carried by descendants who honored their royal heritage despite complete political transformation. The pattern of Germanic personal names in medieval records reveals interesting geographic and social distributions that reflect the original settlement patterns of different Suebi tribal groups. In areas that had been controlled by the Quadi, names with equestrian associations like Fastric, meaning horse ruler, and Eboric, meaning boar rider, remained common among landowning families. In regions dominated by the Marcomanni, military titles adapted into personal names such as Guneric, meaning war ruler, and Hilderic, meaning battle ruler, persisted among the aristocratic classes. The architectural legacy of the Suebi survived in distinctive building techniques and decorative motifs that influenced church construction throughout northwestern Iberia during the Visigothic period and beyond. Germanic craftsmen, working within Christian architectural traditions, incorporated traditional woodworking methods and geometric patterns that created a unique synthesis of cultural influences still visible in surviving 7th-century churches throughout the region. The Church of San Pedro de la Nave, constructed during the late 7th century in what had been the heartland of Suebi territory, exemplifies this cultural fusion in stone and mortar. Its carved capitals feature interlaced patterns that combine Germanic artistic traditions with Byzantine and Roman decorative elements, creating a visual vocabulary that speaks to multiple cultural influences. The structural techniques employed in the church's construction utilized Germanic timber framing methods adapted to support stone masonry walls according to Mediterranean architectural principles, demonstrating the practical innovations that emerged from cultural contact. More subtle but equally significant are the proportional relationships built into these churches, which reflect Germanic concepts of harmony and symmetry that differed from classical Roman architectural theory. Germanic builders traditionally organized space around functional requirements and symbolic meanings rather than mathematical ratios derived from classical orders. This approach created interior spaces that emphasized communal gathering and acoustic properties suitable for Germanic singing traditions, even within the framework of Christian liturgical requirements. The decorative programs of these churches often incorporated motifs that had deep significance in Germanic cultural traditions, adapted to express Christian theological concepts. The interlaced knot patterns that appear frequently in Suebi-influenced churches represent not merely decorative elements, but symbolic expressions of the interconnectedness of all creation, a concept that had roots in Germanic cosmology but found new meaning within Christian theological frameworks. The economic systems that had sustained Suebi society during their period of independence continued to influence regional development under Visigothic rule, as new political arrangements had to accommodate existing patterns of production, trade, and resource exploitation. The Suebi had developed sophisticated techniques for mining the gold and silver deposits that were abundant in Galician mountains, and these operations continued under Visigothic administration with minimal disruption to established procedures and labor arrangements. Archaeological evidence from mining sites near modern Ponferrada and Astorga reveals continuity in extraction techniques and settlement patterns across the political transition. Germanic mining communities that had developed during the Suebi period maintained their specialized knowledge and equipment, adapting gradually to new administrative requirements while preserving the technical expertise that made their operations profitable for successive rulers. The agricultural innovations that had enabled Suebi communities to thrive in the challenging environment of northwestern Iberia proved equally valuable to their Visigothic successors. Germanic techniques for terracing steep slopes, managing water resources in regions with irregular rainfall, and developing crop varieties suitable for marginal soils continued to support dense populations in areas that had been sparsely inhabited during the Roman period. The three-field system of agricultural rotation, which allowed one-third of agricultural land to rest each year while maintaining productive cultivation on the remaining two-thirds, represented one of the most significant Germanic contributions to European agricultural development. This innovation, combined with Germanic techniques for manufacturing improved plows and other agricultural implements, enabled population growth and urban development that characterized European society during the early medieval period. Meanwhile, far to the north along the Rhine frontier where Alemanni tribes had once challenged Roman legions, different patterns of cultural preservation and transformation were emerging under Frankish rule. The gradual Christianization of these territories during the 7th and 8th centuries created new opportunities for documenting Germanic traditions within monastic contexts that valued historical knowledge as part of divine providence. The process of Frankish conquest and integration of Alemanni territories had differed significantly from the Visigothic absorption of the Suebi kingdom. Rather than sudden military conquest followed by political integration, Frankish expansion into Alemanni regions occurred gradually through a combination of military pressure, diplomatic alliance, and cultural assimilation that extended over several generations. The Battle of Tolbiac in 496 CE, where the Frankish king Clovis defeated a coalition of Alemanni tribes, is often cited as the decisive moment in Frankish expansion, but archaeological evidence suggests that the actual process of territorial integration was far more complex and extended. Alemanni communities in regions distant from major Frankish strongholds continued to maintain considerable autonomy well into the 6th century, gradually accepting Frankish overlordship through negotiated agreements rather than military defeat. This gradual integration process created opportunities for cultural preservation that had not existed in regions conquered through rapid military campaigns. Alemanni noble families who demonstrated loyalty to Frankish kings often retained their lands and local authority, creating conditions that favored the preservation of traditional customs and cultural practices within the broader framework of Frankish political organization. The monastery of St. Gallen, founded by Irish missionary Columbanus around 612 CE in former Alemanni territory, became one of the most significant centers for preserving Germanic cultural traditions within a Christian scholarly framework. The monastery's location in the heart of former Alemanni territory was not coincidental, as Columbanus recognized that effective missionary work required understanding and respect for existing cultural traditions. The library at St. Gallen eventually contained thousands of manuscripts, making it one of the largest collections of written knowledge north of the Alps. Among these texts were works that documented Germanic legal traditions, historical chronicles, and poetic compositions that would have been lost without monastic preservation efforts. The monastery's scriptorium became renowned throughout Europe for the quality of its manuscript production and the comprehensiveness of its scholarly collections. The Codex Singalensis, one of the monastery's most famous manuscripts, preserves the only complete text of Tacitus's Germania, along with numerous other classical and Germanic historical sources. This manuscript, copied during the 9th century by monks who understood both Latin and Germanic languages, includes marginal notations that explain Germanic terms and cultural references that would have been obscure to later medieval readers. Among the most significant manuscripts preserved at St. Gallen were copies of the Germanic law codes that had governed Alemanni society during their period of independence. These legal texts, carefully translated into Latin by learned monks who understood both legal traditions, provide crucial insights into Germanic concepts of justice, property rights, and social organization that influenced the development of medieval European legal systems. The Lex Alemanorum, compiled during the early 8th century, represents one of the most comprehensive surviving Germanic law codes. Its provisions reveal sophisticated legal concepts that balanced individual rights with community obligations, established complex compensation systems for resolving disputes, and maintained social hierarchies while providing mechanisms for social mobility through military service and economic achievement. The law code's treatment of agricultural disputes reflects the importance of farming in Alemanni society and their sophisticated understanding of environmental management. Provisions regarding forest use, water rights, and seasonal grazing arrangements demonstrate that Germanic legal traditions had developed detailed frameworks for managing natural resources in ways that balanced individual needs with community sustainability. Particularly interesting are the code's provisions regarding the treatment of different ethnic groups within Alemanni territory. The law recognizes distinct legal categories for Alemanni, Romans, and other populations, but provides mechanisms for legal appeals and protections that suggest a relatively tolerant approach to ethnic diversity. These provisions influenced later medieval legal developments that had to address similar challenges of governing diverse populations within unified political frameworks. The preservation of Germanic historical traditions at St. Gallen extended beyond legal texts to include chronicles, genealogies, and poetic works that documented the heroic achievements of tribal ancestors. The Annals Alemannici, compiled at the monastery during the 8th century, provides one of the most detailed accounts of Germanic tribal movements and political developments during the migration period. These historical texts, written by monks who had access to both written sources and oral traditions maintained by Germanic noble families, offer perspectives on early medieval history that complement and sometimes contradict the accounts provided by Roman and Byzantine historians. They reveal the complex internal politics of Germanic confederations, the strategic considerations that motivated tribal migrations, and the cultural values that shaped Germanic responses to political challenges. The agricultural innovations developed by Germanic peoples during their centuries of territorial expansion continued to influence European farming practices long after their political independence had ended. Germanic techniques for forest clearance, soil improvement, and crop rotation proved particularly valuable in the marginal lands where many tribes had established settlements during the migration period. The heavy plow, developed by Germanic farmers to handle the dense soils of northern European forests, revolutionized agricultural productivity in regions that had been unsuitable for cultivation using Roman farming techniques. This technological innovation, combined with Germanic expertise in iron production, enabled the systematic clearance of forested regions and their conversion to agricultural use on a scale unprecedented in European history. Germanic livestock management practices, particularly their techniques for breeding horses suitable for heavy cavalry warfare, provided the foundation for military innovations that would define medieval European warfare. The development of stirrups, improved saddles, and specialized breeding programs that produced the destriers used by medieval knights reflected Germanic cultural contributions that extended far beyond their period of political independence. The systematic approach to horse breeding developed by Germanic peoples involved careful attention to bloodlines, selective breeding for specific characteristics, and sophisticated understanding of nutrition and training methods. These techniques, preserved and developed within monastery stables and noble estates throughout former Germanic territories, created the foundation for medieval Europe's military superiority over neighboring civilizations. Germanic techniques for cattle breeding proved equally influential in the development of medieval European agriculture. Germanic farmers had developed breeds that were larger and more productive than Roman cattle, while also being better adapted to the climate and environmental conditions of Northern Europe. These improved livestock breeds provided increased meat and dairy production that supported larger populations and more complex economic activities. The trading networks established by Germanic peoples during their territorial expansions created commercial relationships that persisted long after political transformation had altered territorial boundaries. Germanic merchants had developed sophisticated techniques for long-distance trade that included standardized weights and measures, credit arrangements, and diplomatic protocols that facilitated commercial exchange across cultural boundaries. The amber trade routes that connected Baltic coastal regions with Mediterranean markets had been largely controlled by Germanic intermediaries who maintained trading posts, provided security for merchant caravans, and facilitated cultural exchange between distant regions. These commercial networks continued to operate under different political arrangements, but their basic structures reflected Germanic innovations in commercial organization and diplomatic practice. Archaeological evidence from trading centers throughout former Germanic territories reveals the continued importance of these commercial networks during the early medieval period. Sites like Dorstad in the Netherlands and Quentavik in northern France, which became major commercial centers during the Carolingian period, were built upon foundations established during the Germanic migrations and incorporated organizational principles developed by Germanic traders. The techniques for organizing and protecting merchant caravans developed by Germanic traders influenced the development of medieval European commercial law and practice. Germanic innovations in commercial contracts, dispute resolution, and risk management provided models that were adapted and expanded by medieval Italian and Flemish merchants who dominated later European trade networks. Germanic techniques for metalworking, particularly their methods for producing high-quality steel weapons and agricultural tools, continued to influence European craftsmanship throughout the medieval period. Germanic smiths had developed sophisticated understanding of metallurgical processes that enabled them to create superior weapons and tools, knowledge that was preserved and transmitted through guild traditions in the emerging medieval towns. The pattern welding technique developed by Germanic smiths, which involved folding and hammering steel to create distinctive patterns while improving strength and flexibility, represented one of the most advanced metallurgical practices of the early medieval period. This technique required precise control of temperature and timing that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of materials science, knowledge that was carefully guarded and passed down through apprenticeship traditions. Germanic innovations in iron and steel production included improved furnace designs that achieved higher temperatures, more efficient charcoal production methods, and specialized tools for working hot metal. These technological advances enabled the production of agricultural implements that were stronger and more durable than earlier Roman designs, contributing to the agricultural revolution that supported medieval European population growth. The cultural synthesis that emerged from Germanic and Roman interaction during the migration period provided intellectual foundations for the Carolingian Renaissance of the 8th and 9th centuries. Scholars at the court of Charlemagne, many of whom descended from Germanic noble families, combined classical learning with Germanic cultural traditions to create new forms of literature, art, and political theory that influenced European civilization for centuries. The palace school at Aachen, where Charlemagne gathered scholars from throughout Europe, became a center for cultural innovation that drew upon both Roman educational traditions and Germanic approaches to knowledge preservation and transmission. The curriculum developed at Aachen incorporated classical Latin texts with Germanic legal codes, historical chronicles, and poetic traditions to create educational programs that prepared administrators for governing diverse populations within the expanding Frankish Empire. Alcuin of York, the Anglo-Saxon scholar who directed educational reforms at Charlemagne's court, understood that effective administration of Germanic populations required familiarity with their cultural traditions and legal customs. His educational programs included instruction in Germanic languages and legal traditions alongside classical Latin literature and Christian theology, creating a generation of administrators who could navigate complex cultural boundaries. The epic poetry traditions that had preserved Germanic historical memory and cultural values were transformed during the Carolingian period into written literature that combined traditional heroic themes with Christian theological concepts. Works like the Heliand, which retold the Christian gospel story using Germanic literary conventions and poetic techniques, demonstrated the continued vitality of Germanic cultural traditions within evolving European civilization. The Heliand, composed during the early 9th century by an unknown Saxon poet, represents one of the most sophisticated examples of cultural synthesis from the early medieval period. The poem transforms the Christian salvation narrative using traditional Germanic alliterative verse, heroic vocabulary, and cultural references that made the story accessible to Germanic audiences while maintaining theological orthodoxy. The poem's treatment of Christ as a Germanic war leader gathering his comitatus of disciples reflects deep understanding of both Christian theology and Germanic social structures. This cultural translation enabled effective Christian missionary work among Germanic populations while preserving elements of traditional cultural identity that might otherwise have been lost during religious conversion. Similar works of cultural synthesis appeared throughout former Germanic territories during the Carolingian period, as scholars and poets worked to create literature that honored both Christian faith and ancestral heritage. These works provided models for later medieval literature that continued to draw upon Germanic themes and artistic techniques while expressing Christian theological concepts. The legal traditions developed by Germanic peoples during their period of independence continued to influence European jurisprudence throughout the medieval period and beyond. Germanic concepts of individual rights, community responsibility, and judicial procedure provided alternatives to Roman legal traditions that proved particularly valuable for governing diverse populations in frontier regions. The Germanic emphasis on compensation rather than punishment for most legal offenses reflected cultural values that prioritized community harmony and practical problem-solving over abstract principles of justice. This approach proved particularly effective in regions where diverse ethnic groups needed to coexist within unified political frameworks, as it provided flexible mechanisms for resolving disputes without imposing uniform cultural standards. Germanic legal traditions also emphasized community participation in judicial decisions through assemblies of free men who evaluated evidence and determined appropriate responses to legal violations. This participatory approach to justice provided foundation for later medieval developments in representative government and democratic decision-making that distinguished European political traditions from more authoritarian systems in other parts of the world. The concept of personal law, which allowed different ethnic groups within the same territory to be governed by their ancestral legal traditions, represented another Germanic contribution to medieval European legal development. This principle enabled rulers to govern diverse populations without imposing cultural uniformity, creating space for minority groups to maintain their distinctive identities while participating in broader political communities. As the centuries passed and medieval Europe took shape, the descendants of the Great Suebi Confederation found themselves scattered across the continent, their identity transformed but not erased by the complex processes of cultural change and political reorganization. In the noble houses of Leon and Castile, Genealogies still traced bloodlines back to Suebi kings who had ruled in Galatia centuries earlier. In the trading cities along the Rhine, merchant families maintained commercial practices that echoed ancient Germanic trading traditions. In the monasteries of Bavaria and Swabia, scholarly traditions preserved legal codes and historical chronicles that documented the achievements of tribal ancestors. The persistence of Germanic cultural identity in these various forms demonstrates the resilience of cultural traditions that had developed over centuries of shared experience. Even when political structures disappeared and territorial boundaries shifted, cultural practices adapted to new circumstances while maintaining essential characteristics that connected later generations with their ancestral heritage. In the monasteries of St. Emmeram in Regensburg and Fulda in Hesse, monks continued to copy and preserve manuscripts that documented Germanic history and culture. These institutions served as repositories for cultural memory that might otherwise have been lost during periods of political upheaval and social transformation. Their libraries contain not only religious texts but also secular works that preserve knowledge of Germanic law, history, poetry, and cultural practices. The School of Fulda, established by Saint Boniface during the 8th century, became particularly renowned for its historical scholarship and its preservation of Germanic cultural traditions. The monastery's scholars, many of whom descended from Germanic noble families, understood the importance of documenting their ancestral heritage while adapting it to Christian theological frameworks. The Annals Fuldenses, compiled at the monastery during the 9th century, provides one of the most detailed chronicles of Germanic political development and cultural change during the early medieval period. This historical work draws upon both written sources and oral traditions to create a comprehensive account of Germanic tribal movements, political alliances, and cultural transformations that shaped European development. The influence of Germanic cultural traditions on medieval European art and architecture extended far beyond the survival of specific decorative motifs or building techniques. Germanic approaches to artistic expression emphasized symbolic meaning, narrative content, and community participation in ways that distinguished medieval European art from classical Roman and Byzantine traditions. The illuminated manuscripts produced in monasteries throughout former Germanic territories during the early medieval period demonstrate this cultural synthesis in visual form. Works like the Book of Kells and the Lindisfarne Gospels combine Christian religious content with artistic techniques and decorative patterns that derive from Germanic cultural traditions. The interlaced patterns, animal motifs, and geometric designs that characterize these manuscripts reflect aesthetic principles developed by Germanic artists during the migration period. These artistic traditions emphasize the interconnectedness of all creation, the importance of movement and transformation, and the symbolic significance of natural forms that had deep roots in Germanic cosmology and religious belief. Germanic approaches to architectural space also influenced the development of medieval European church design in ways that distinguished it from earlier Roman and Byzantine models. Germanic churches emphasized horizontal rather than vertical space, community gathering rather than hierarchical separation, and acoustic properties suitable for congregational participation in religious services. The development of Romanesque and later Gothic architectural styles incorporated Germanic spatial concepts and structural techniques while adapting them to Christian liturgical requirements. The emphasis on light, height, and transcendent space that characterizes Gothic architecture reflects synthesis of Germanic artistic traditions with Christian theological concepts and classical architectural principles. In the political sphere, Germanic traditions of assembly decision-making and personal loyalty relationships continued to influence European governmental development throughout the medieval period. The feudal system that dominated medieval European politics incorporated Germanic concepts of personal bonds between leaders and followers, while medieval representative institutions like the English Parliament drew upon Germanic traditions of community assemblies. The Germanic concept of kingship, which emphasized the ruler's responsibility to his people rather than absolute authority over them, provided alternative models to Roman imperial traditions that influenced the development of medieval European monarchy. Germanic kings were expected to demonstrate military prowess, provide for their followers' welfare, and maintain justice through consultation with noble assemblies rather than arbitrary decree. These political traditions proved particularly important during periods of territorial expansion and cultural contact, as they provided flexible frameworks for incorporating diverse populations into unified political communities. The success of medieval European expansion into Eastern Europe, the Baltic region, and the Mediterranean drew upon governmental techniques that had originated in Germanic political traditions. The great migrations had ended, the kingdoms had fallen, and the confederations had dissolved, but the Suebi and their Germanic kinsmen had achieved a form of immortality that transcended political boundaries. They lived on in the genetic heritage of millions of Europeans, in the institutional structures of emerging nations, in the cultural practices that defined regional identity, and in the collective memory that celebrated the courage and ingenuity of those who had dared to challenge the might of Rome itself. Modern genetic research has provided scientific confirmation for the demographic impact of Germanic migrations on European population structure. Analysis of Y chromosome haplogroups characteristic of Germanic populations shows concentrations that correspond remarkably closely to the territorial distributions described in ancient historical sources, providing objective evidence for the scale and persistence of Germanic settlement patterns. The R1b, U106 haplogroup, which is strongly associated with Germanic populations, reaches its highest frequencies in regions that correspond to ancient Suebi territories and migration routes. This genetic evidence suggests that Germanic demographic impact on European population structure was more significant and long-lasting than previously understood based solely on historical and archaeological evidence. Mitochondrial DNA analysis reveals similar patterns of Germanic influence on European population genetics, with distinctive lineages that can be traced to specific regions and time periods associated with Germanic migrations. These genetic signatures provide objective measures of population movement and settlement that complement and confirm patterns suggested by historical and archaeological evidence. The place names that the European landscape provide another form of cultural immortality for the Suebi and their related Germanic peoples. From Swabia in southwestern Germany, whose very name derives directly from the Suebi Confederation, to hundreds of smaller towns and geographical features whose names preserve Germanic linguistic elements, the map of Europe itself serves as a monument to Germanic cultural influence. Toponymic analysis reveals systematic patterns of Germanic settlement and territorial organization that extend far beyond the regions traditionally associated with Germanic political control. River names, mountain names, and settlement names throughout Central and Western Europe preserve Germanic linguistic elements that provide evidence for the extent of Germanic cultural influence during the migration period. The persistence of Germanic place names in regions that were later conquered by Romance-speaking peoples demonstrates the deep roots that Germanic settlements established during the migration period. Even centuries of political domination by different linguistic groups could not completely eliminate toponymic evidence of earlier Germanic presence and cultural influence. In the folk traditions of rural communities throughout former Germanic territories, ethnographers have documented the persistence of customs, beliefs, and practices that can be traced back to pre-Christian Germanic culture. Seasonal festivals, agricultural rituals, and folk tales preserve elements of ancient worldviews that survived centuries of Christianization and political transformation, maintaining connections to cultural traditions that define Germanic identity during their period of independence. The celebration of seasonal cycles through festivals that mark agricultural and astronomical events reflects Germanic cultural traditions that emphasized harmony between human communities and natural rhythms. These observances, adapted to Christian religious calendars but retaining their essential character, demonstrate the persistence of cultural values that had developed over centuries of Germanic cultural evolution. Folk tales and oral traditions throughout former Germanic territories preserve narrative themes, character types, and moral frameworks that derive from pre-Christian Germanic culture. Stories that emphasize individual courage, loyalty to kinship groups, and the importance of honor in human relationships reflect cultural values that had defined Germanic society during the migration period. The persistence of these cultural traditions in oral form demonstrates their deep significance for community identity and their effectiveness in transmitting cultural values across generations. Even when written literature and formal education emphasized different cultural traditions, oral culture maintained connections to ancestral heritage that provided continuity with the past. The legal systems of modern European nations retain elements that can be traced to Germanic law codes developed during the migration period. Concepts of individual rights, property ownership, and judicial procedure that form foundations of contemporary legal systems reflect the influence of Germanic legal traditions that emphasize compensation rather than punishment, community participation in legal decisions, and the balance between individual freedom and collective responsibility. The Germanic legal principle that individuals should be judged by their peers rather than by appointed officials provided foundation for jury systems that became central features of English and American legal traditions. This participatory approach to justice reflected Germanic cultural values that emphasized community responsibility for maintaining social order and resolving disputes. Germanic property law concepts that recognized both individual ownership and community rights to natural resources influenced the development of medieval and modern European land tenure systems. These legal traditions provided frameworks for balancing individual economic interests with community needs that proved particularly valuable during periods of territorial expansion and economic development. The concept of written law codes that could be consulted and applied consistently, rather than arbitrary decision-making by rulers, represented another Germanic contribution to European legal development. Germanic law codes provided models for systematic legal thinking that influenced the development of medieval canon law, royal legislation, and eventually modern constitutional systems. In the realm of language and literature, Germanic cultural traditions provided foundation for the development of vernacular literatures that distinguished medieval Europe from other civilizations that continued to rely primarily on classical languages for written expression. The Germanic tradition of oral poetry and storytelling provided models for creating literature in local languages that could express cultural identity and community values. The alliterative verse traditions that had preserved Germanic historical memory and cultural values provided technical foundations for medieval literature in Germanic languages. Works like Beowulf, the Nibelungenlied, and the Poetic Edda demonstrate the continued vitality of Germanic literary traditions and their adaptation to Christian theological and medieval political contexts. Germanic linguistic influence on the development of Romance languages created distinctive regional dialects that preserved Germanic vocabulary, grammatical structures, and phonological features within Romance linguistic frameworks. These hybrid linguistic traditions reflected the complex cultural interactions that characterized medieval European society and provided evidence for the persistence of Germanic cultural identity within transformed political circumstances. The development of distinctive national literatures in medieval Europe drew upon both classical traditions and Germanic cultural heritage to create literary traditions that expressed emerging national identities. The combination of Germanic narrative themes with classical rhetorical techniques and Christian theological concepts created uniquely European literary traditions that influenced world literature for centuries. As we settle deeper into the quiet of this peaceful night, we can almost hear the echoes of ancient voices carried on the wind, the war songs of Suebi warriors gathering around their fires in the depths of Germanic forests, the measured deliberations of tribal assemblies debating the fate of their peoples under starlit skies, the fervent prayers of Germanic converts seeking divine guidance as they navigated the transformation of their world from paganism to Christianity, from tribal confederation to medieval kingdom. These voices remind us that history is not merely a sequence of dates and events recorded by distant chroniclers, but the living story of real people facing challenges not unlike our own. The need to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances while preserving what is valuable from the past, the desire to maintain cultural identity within larger political communities, and the eternal human quest for meaning, belonging, and purpose in an uncertain and often dangerous world. The Suebi succeeded not because they were the strongest or most numerous of ancient peoples. Indeed, they faced enemies who often possessed superior resources and more advanced military technology. They succeeded because they possessed the wisdom to adapt when adaptation was necessary, the courage to face uncertainty without abandoning their essential values, and the vision to see beyond immediate circumstances to longer-term possibilities for their people's survival and prosperity. Their legacy teaches us that cultural identity can survive political transformation, that strength comes from unity in diversity rather than rigid uniformity, and that the most profound victories are often achieved not through military conquest, but through the patient work of building institutions, preserving knowledge, nurturing the next generation, and maintaining hope during periods of difficulty and transition. The Suebi demonstrated that small communities can influence the course of world history when they act with determination and intelligent planning. Their confederations never matched Rome in terms of military resources or territorial extent, but their political innovations, military techniques, and cultural achievements influenced European development in ways that proved more lasting than many larger empires. Their understanding that cultural identity could be maintained while adapting to new political circumstances provided models for survival and prosperity that remained relevant throughout European history. Their ability to synthesize different cultural traditions while maintaining essential characteristics provided foundations for the cultural creativity that characterized medieval European civilization. In our own time, as we face challenges that seem unprecedented in their complexity and global scope, we might draw inspiration from these ancient Germanic peoples who transformed crisis into opportunity, who found strength in confederation and alliance rather than isolation and domination, and who understood that true immortality comes not from avoiding change, but from contributing something valuable to the ongoing human story. The Suebi faced environmental challenges, demographic pressures, military threats, and political upheavals that threatened their survival as distinct peoples, but they responded with innovations that enabled not only their survival, but their contribution to the development of European civilization. Their agricultural techniques, political institutions, legal traditions, and cultural practices provided foundations that supported European development for centuries. Their ability to maintain unity across diverse populations and extensive territories provided models for political organization that influenced medieval and modern European governmental development. Their legal traditions that balanced individual rights with community responsibilities provided foundations for democratic institutions that distinguished European political development from more authoritarian traditions in other parts of the world. Their cultural traditions that valued both individual achievement and community solidarity provided ethical frameworks that influenced European social development and created space for individual creativity within collective identity. Their religious traditions that emphasized the sacred nature of oaths and the importance of honor in human relationships provided moral foundations that survived conversion to Christianity and continued to influence European cultural development. Sleep peacefully now, knowing that you are part of that continuing story, connected across the centuries to all who have sought to build something better than what they inherited, to leave the world a little more just, a little more beautiful, a little more hopeful than they found it. The courage of the Suebi flows in your veins through the complex genetic heritage that connects all Europeans to their ancient ancestors. Their wisdom whispers in your dreams through cultural traditions that have been preserved and transmitted across generations. And their enduring legacy reminds us that every ending is also a beginning. Every sunset promises a new dawn. And every generation has the opportunity to write the next chapter in humanity's greatest adventure. The story of the Suebi teaches us that cultural identity transcends political boundaries, that human creativity flourishes when different traditions meet and interact, and that the greatest achievements often emerge from periods of challenge and transformation rather than times of ease and comfort. Their legacy lives on in the institutions, languages, laws, and customs that define European civilization, but more importantly, in the spirit of adaptation, innovation, and hope that enabled them to transform challenges into opportunities for growth and development. May your dreams carry you across the ancient forests of Germania, where the spirits of the Suebi still dance around eternal fires, celebrating not the kingdoms they lost, but the civilization they helped to create. Not the battles they fought, but the peace they ultimately made possible. Not the past they left behind, but the future they helped to build. Rest well, and wake tomorrow ready to add your own courage, wisdom, and creativity to their enduring story, carrying forward the flame of human achievement that they kept burning through 7 centuries of challenge and transformation.